All right, well, it is 10 o'clock, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our session. This morning's session is going to cover accelerated instruction and students served by special education. We do know that there continue to be questions regarding how the new state requirements in House Bill 4545 apply to students with disabilities who are served by special education. Especially given that our students with disabilities have specific rights and entitlements under both state and federal law. So this morning's session will provide an overview on this topic and hopefully equip you at the conclusion of our time together today with a better understanding of the specific requirements for students with disabilities who have IEPs and are served by special education, specifically the requirements in the Texas Education Code, and how those requirements interact with other state and federal requirements. So with that said, I'll jump over to, there we go, introduction. So I'm Jacob Klett. I'm the Director of Special Education Strategic Integration in the Office of Special Populations and Monitoring at TEA. Someone recently asked me if all of that fits on a business card, and the answer is it does if you print it really, really small. So I've had the opportunity over the past 10 months or so since House Bill 4545 passed last spring to work collaboratively with some cross-functional folks here at TEA in supporting districts and schools with guidance on implementation of House Bill 4545. And I'm excited to be here this morning to speak with you and highlight some of these requirements and how they support our students with disabilities. I'm also very excited to have a colleague of mine here to co-present with me, who's been really instrumental in supporting this work here at the agency as well. So Liz, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself to the group this morning.
Thanks, Jacob. Hi, everyone. My name is Lizeth Barraza. I go by Liz in English, so you can call me Liz. And I'm an education specialist here at TEA within the Special Education Programs Division.
Great, thanks, Liz. So today we have a couple of objectives. First, we'll just provide a foundational overview of House Bill 4545 and describe its impact on accelerated instruction requirements. This may be a refresher for some folks in the audience today. Then we'll specifically take a look at some of the requirements of ARD committees, which is Admission, Review, and Dismissal Committee. And these are the folks who make decisions about special education programming and students' individual education programs or IEPs. ARD committees do have specific responsibilities regarding accelerated instruction under the new statutory requirements that were established by House Bill 4545. So we'll definitely dive into those a little bit this morning and make sure that we highlight what those requirements are and how they interact with other ARD committee requirements as well. And then finally, toward the end of today's session, we will take some time to address some of the questions that TEA continues to receive rather frequently around the topic of accelerated instruction and students with disabilities. These will be the most commonly asked questions that we've received from local education agency staff about the requirements of HB 4545 and how those requirements specifically relate or apply for students who have disabilities and are served in special education. So let's dive in and just start today by framing out an overview of House Bill 4545, and then we'll work to connect these requirements as we move through today's session specifically to the special education requirements. So of course we know that HB 4545 passed during the regular 87th Texas legislative session last spring and became effective in June of 2021. When House Bill 4545 passed last spring, it amended the Texas Education Code, specifically Section 280211, which established some new requirements for accelerated instruction for all students who were not successful on the STAAR, the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness. It also eliminated grade retention and retest requirements for students in grades 5 and 8, which had previously been in place, and it created a new state requirement for local education agencies to establish something called accelerated learning committees. And these specifically address the needs for accelerated instruction for students who are not successful in STAAR tests in grades 3, 5, and 8 explicitly in reading and And it also clarified some prior accelerated instruction requirements, and we'll talk a bit about what that means today as well. So let's start just by diving into a little bit around accelerated learning. So in thinking about this topic, it is important to note here that the Texas Education Code has actually included some longstanding requirements for local education agencies to provide accelerated instruction to students who are not successful on state assessments. When House Bill 4545 went into effect in June of 2021, the requirement for local education agencies to provide accelerated learning was clarified. And the TEC, or the Texas Education Code TEC, was amended to establish two options for providing accelerated instruction when a student requires it. These options previously had been left undefined. So let's start just by taking a look at those options now. So, of course, option one is the option to assign a student who is not successful on an area of the state assessment to a teacher who is certified as a master exemplary or recognized teacher for the subsequent school year in that applicable subject area. The designations under option one are related to the teacher incentive allotment, or TIA. Additionally, the student's parent or guardian can request a specific classroom teacher if more than one teacher is available in that area who meets the TIA designation requirements. Schools should consider those requests as they're part of the decision-making process around accelerated instruction. And currently, it's important to note too that there are slightly over 4,000 or so teachers across the state that meet the requirements for option one. We do anticipate that more and more teachers will become designated through the TIA process to support local education agencies and meeting the accelerated instruction requirements in House Bill 4545. However, it is a multi-year process for teachers to obtain the TIA designation, so do want to recognize that as well. There is a second option, of course, that I'm sure many folks who are attending today are very familiar with. This is the option to provide supplemental accelerated instruction, which is at least 30 hours of supplemental instruction tutoring in the subject area where that student was not successful. Under option two, it is important to note that the student must be provided a minimum of 30 hours of supplemental instruction in each subject area where that student was not successful on the state assessment. So of course, there may be circumstances in which a student requires supplemental instruction in multiple areas. And again, this is the requirement that applies to all students. And we'll clarify some of the specific components around ARD committee decision-making and students with disabilities, but generally these requirements do apply to all students, including our students who are served by special education. So just kind of diving a little bit more into the supplemental accelerated learning requirements, and this likely is a refresher for many, but just want to make sure we're grounding our time together in these requirements. Supplemental instruction must be targeted in the TEKS. It is intended to supplement the standard instruction that students receive in those subject areas. As mentioned before, it does need to be a minimum of 30 hours that can be provided subsequently during the summer or the school year following the student's administration of the state assessment. If the LEA opts to do this during the school year, it does need to occur at least once per week. The intention here in providing supplemental accelerated instruction to any student is to help ensure that student achieves satisfactory performance in that subject area on the subsequent administration. There are some guidelines here, so when thinking about the provision of supplemental accelerated learning, it is intended to be provided individually to a student or in a group of no more than 3. However, there is the option to increase the group size to a larger group size, assuming that the parent or guardian of each student in that supplemental instruction group authorize the larger group to provide that supplemental accelerated learning. The tutoring or supplemental accelerated learning does need to be provided by someone in the district, a person that has the training in those applicable instructional materials, and who is under the oversight of the school district. And then, of course, where possible, it is best for that person who is trained in those materials to provide the entirety of that supplemental instruction to the student who requires it. Let's jump to the next one. There's a few pieces just for LEAs to keep in mind as they're considering providing supplemental accelerated instruction. So again, that's the 30 hours of tutoring or additional instruction. These especially apply when we're thinking about providing these services to students during the school year. There are some parameters here. So students cannot be removed from certain pieces of the school day, specifically instruction and grade level content in what's considered the foundation curriculum. So that's sort of our core curriculum, reading, math, science, social studies, those pieces. Students also can't be removed from what's considered enrichment curriculum. So some examples of that are languages other than English, CTE courses, fine arts, health or PE. Students also can't be removed from recess or physical activity. That's available to other students enrolled in the same grade. We do recognize that this does set up a significant need to rethink some master schedules and staffing patterns. That's not the focus of today's instruction, but today's session, but did just want to name that here as well. As we're thinking about the provision of accelerated learning for students in grades 3 through 12, the central question really is to determine whether the student requires accelerated instruction is to start with this question of whether the student achieves satisfactory performance on the STAAR or EOC assessment. That question applies globally to any subject area. If the student was successful, so just sort of following that pathway over there on the left in the green, student was successful, then no additional actions needed there. No accelerated instruction is required in that subject area. However, if the student was not successful, then that student must be provided with accelerated instruction. As a reminder, if the school does intend to meet that requirement using supplemental instruction, then that's at least 30 hours of supplemental instruction in each subject area where that student was not successful in the STAAR or the STAAR EOC. All right, so that was just a sort of high-level overview of the requirements of HB 4545 and accelerated instruction. I'm going to pass it now over to Liz to step us through some of the requirements that apply for accelerated learning committees. So Liz, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So as Jacob mentioned, one of the new requirements by the HB 4545 is that of the accelerated learning committees. And accelerated learning committees, what it is that local education agencies are required to establish these ALCs in order to support students who did not pass a 3rd, 5th, or 8th grade reading or math STAAR test. Accelerated learning committees have replaced the required grade level placement committees in the previous law for certain students in 5th and 8th grade. We'll talk a little bit more here about what some of the components of ALCs are. So if you can see here on this slide, we have that ALCs are required for students who don't perform satisfactorily in a STAAR test or STAAR Alt 2. That means STAAR being, sorry, Jacob, STAAR being any STAAR reading or math for 3rd, 5th, or 8th grade, they scored either the student scored in the developing range in the STAAR Alt 2 or in the does not meet range in the STAAR test for those subject areas. So the ALC is charged with developing a plan, which we'll call the accelerated learning plan, for any student who fits that category. And these plans are put in place before the subsequent school year. So as soon as we find those STAAR results, it's a good idea to start planning for AI for that student so that by the start of the next school year, the student has their learning plan in place. The accelerated learning plan has to be documented in writing, and a copy must be provided to the parent or guardian of the child. And then the other component of the ALP does include that the goal really is for students to perform at a grade level by the end of the school year. Should the student be reassessed the following year via the STAAR test and the student does not perform satisfactorily again in that subject area that they missed the previous year, then a superintendent is forms a part of that committee for the following year. And I'll share more about that here in just a sec. We can go to the next slide, Jacob. So as I mentioned earlier, there are specific members that are required per HB 4545 to make up the Accelerated Learning Committee. So as you see on this slide, we have the principal or principal's designee as a required member, the student's parent or guardian, and then the teacher of the subject of the assessment on which the student failed to pass. As I said, if the student did not perform satisfactorily in the following year STAAR assessment, then a superintendent is invited to be a part of that student's committee. And the committee should talk about what additional supports that student might require and update that ALP as necessary. We can go to the next slide. So Jacob mentioned earlier the central question around determining whether a student has an AI requirement or not is 3 to 12, did the student perform satisfactorily? For the ALCs in particular, it's did the student take a 3rd, 5th, or 8th grade STAAR math or reading and fail or not perform satisfactorily? In that case, then any kiddo that meets that criteria will be required to have an ALC prepare their accelerated learning plan. We can go to the next slide. For ALCs, this is just a recommended agenda that covers some of the components of the ALC planning meeting. Very standard introduction, purpose of meeting, reviewing the assessment data. Of course, you want to review the STAAR assessment data. Now, for HB 4545, an ALC is required if the student did not take the exam as well, the assessment. So reviewing of assessment data then becomes really important as well, because you can establish a plan that's in line with what needs the student has. Teacher feedback, make sure that the teachers are including information about the student that might be relevant to the development of their plan, as well as answer any parent questions, any parent concerns. Some questions that come to mind around transportation: what supports will the student be provided? What is the role of the parent to ensure that the student is, for example, attending their supplemental accelerated instruction? Should that be the course that the Accelerated Learning Committee takes to provide the student accelerated instruction? And then, of course, developing the plan. How and when will this AI occur? Is it going to take the pathway of assigning a master teacher? Is it going to take the pathway of the supplemental accelerated instruction? What does that look like for that child? When is this being provided, etc.? And then consider any questions and establish a close to that meeting. We can move on to the next slide. And so here we have a slide that just a quick screenshot of or snapshot of the resources available to LEAs. I believe Jeannie has shared a link to the resources page, if I'm correct. You can access this resources page that TA has dedicated for accelerated learning specifically. There's a frequently asked questions document there that's super helpful. There's other resources like a sample accelerated learning plan, a template that's both in English and Spanish. There's also additional planning documents for ALCs, and then of course resources for families around HB 4545. And so now we're going to discuss a little bit more at length the ARD Committee responsibilities when it comes to developing accelerated instruction plans. So I'll hand it over to Jacob so he can share a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks, Liz. As Liz mentioned, there are some specific requirements of our ARD committees. Those are our admission, review, and dismissal committees that make decisions regarding programming for students with disabilities who have IEPs. So let's dive into just a little bit of background here. ARD committees in general have some specific requirements under state and federal law. Under Texas Administrative Code in Chapter 89, that's at TAC 891050, you'll find all of the requirements that apply for admission, review, and dismissal committees. The requirement that I think most of us are likely familiar with is the requirement to serve as the student's IEP team in developing the individualized education program for that student, which is a requirement under federal law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that is the primary responsibility of the ARD committee, to ensure that that federal requirement is met for each qualifying student. ARD committees also have some requirements under state law as well. And specifically highlighting here today that ARD committees have responsibilities that are designated under 891050 at section A8 and 891050 A10, which have to do with satisfactory performance on state assessment instruments, specifically accelerated learning or accelerated instruction. As we mentioned sort of toward the top of the presentation, there have been longstanding responsibilities for local education agencies to provide accelerated learning to all students who are not successful on state assessments. And these requirements for ARD committees are no different. The requirement for ARD committees to address accelerated instruction needs for students with disabilities has been longstanding in the TEC for some time. So with the passage of HB 4545, this requirement for ARD committees has shifted somewhat, and we'll speak now specifically to some of the requirements of ARD committees as they serve the function of accelerated learning committees that Liz just walked us through. So one thing that's really important to note, just to kind of ground any decision making around accelerated learning for students who are served in special education, these requirements generally do apply to all students. So every student who is not successful on a state assessment is entitled to receive accelerated instruction to help them be more successful in that subject area. Our students with disabilities truly are general education students first and foremost. And as such, our students with disabilities do have the same right to accelerated instruction anytime they are not successful in an area of the STAAR. We really think of accelerated instruction as an extension of high quality Tier 1 instruction. So from an equity standpoint, our students with disabilities should be afforded the same access, which is their right to participate in accelerated instruction alongside their non-disabled peers, just as they would with any Tier 1 subject area. Would be expected for our students with disabilities to have equal access and engage in those learning activities. As ARD committees are making decisions about accelerated learning for students with disabilities, it is important that they do consider the individual needs of that student and make determinations about whether certain adjustments to the accelerated instruction plan are appropriate based on the student's presenting needs and the needs of that student related to their disability. However, in all cases, it is important for ARD committees to provide supplemental accelerated instruction in accordance with the TEC, again, the requirements at Section 280211, which were amended by House Bill 4545, that any accelerated instruction provided for a student with a disability should meet all of those requirements. The only exception to that really is in a situation where potentially the delivery of that accelerated instruction would in some way deny the student a free and appropriate public education. And we'll speak a little bit more about that as we move through the next couple of slides. So who makes decisions about accelerated instruction for students with disabilities? Well, House Bill 4545 established that those accelerated learning committees that Liz stepped us through just a few moments ago that apply for all students, for students with disabilities who are served by special education and who are in grades 3, 5, and 8 and did not pass the STAAR reading or math assessment, the ARD committee is required to serve the function of that ALC. HB 4545 also requires that the ARD committee meets to address the student's need for accelerated learning, and as Liz mentioned earlier, document that accelerated learning in a formalized plan that outlines how that student will participate in accelerated instruction. And there are some additional requirements to keep in mind here. ARD committees, when they convene and meet together, have certain requirements under state and federal law. And so when ARD committees are required to meet for the purpose of serving as an ALC, it is critical that that ARD committee be a what's called a properly constituted ARD committee with all the required participants in attendance. The primary participants that are required in an ARD committee are listed here on the slide over to the left. So at a minimum, ARD committees to be properly constituted with the appropriate members do need to include the student's parent or guardian, a representative from the local education agency who has decision-making authority and has the ability to commit resources. That might be a campus administrator, that might be someone from the district office in the special education department, a regular education teacher or general education teacher is a required participant in an ARD committee for a student with a disability. Someone must be present who can interpret the results of evaluations. The student's special education teacher is also a required participant, and wherever appropriate, the child who's receiving services. It is recommended that the student actually participate in these decisions and have some autonomy in supporting the development of their individual education program. For the purposes of accelerated instruction, these folks do need to convene as the ARD committee for that student and serve the function of the ALC. They need to consider the student's learning needs as documented in the IEP and determine the manner in which that student will participate in accelerated learning, essentially how they can be provided with the services in the IEP and also with the services they're entitled to under state law regarding accelerated instruction. The documentation of the accelerated learning plan can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be a supplemental attachment that's provided as an attachment to the student's IEP, or some ARD committees may opt to describe the accelerated learning within the deliberations component of the IEP. However, those are the options that ARD committees may use to document accelerated learning plans for students who are served by special education. Just a couple of pieces to tease out from there. The ARD committee's primary responsibility when they are serving as an ALC for a student is to determine the manner in which that student will engage in instruction, particularly when it comes to supplemental accelerated instruction, so that 30 hours requirement. ARD committees need to be really mindful of any individual needs of the student with a disability when they're determining the manner in which that student will engage. So really thinking about what that needs to look like for the student, what options are available, and how that student can most effectively engage in the services that they need as part of their IEP, and also the instruction that they require under the Texas Education Code. So again, the only exception to this, we are often asked if ARD committees have the authority to waive the requirements of TEC that were established by House Bill 4545. ARD committees don't have the authority to waive the requirements outright. They do need to be very thoughtful and mindful of any possible situations in which somehow meeting the state requirement for accelerated instruction might in some way deny that student access to a free, appropriate public education or FAPE. That being said, it is strongly encouraged that ARD committees consider a variety of options in the delivery of accelerated instruction and really think about flexible options, things like intersessional tutoring or virtual tutoring that might support a student in being able to engage in all of their IEP services that they need to make progress, and also be able to participate meaningfully in accelerated instruction as well. Students who participate participate in the STAAR Alternate 2, those are students with significant cognitive disabilities, also do have some requirements in terms of accelerated instruction. ARD committees for students who do meet the eligibility criteria for participation in STAAR Alternate 2 also have the obligation under state law, under Texas Education Code, to serve as the Accelerated Learning Committee for any student who has an IEP. So of course that includes our students with disabilities who participate in the regular STAR assessment, as well as our students with disabilities who participate in the STAR Alternate 2. So any student with a disability who is not successful on the reading or the math component of the STAR Alternate 2 does require the convening of the ARD committee serving as the ALC. When the ARD committee convenes as the ALC for a student who does meet the participation requirements for STAR Alternate 2, they should be considering the student's needs for accelerated instruction in the applicable subject areas, really thinking about how that student can engage effectively in an accelerated learning program that's rooted in the student's strengths and needs that are outlined in the student's individual education program. One thing that is really critical to keep in mind as we're thinking about how accelerated learning decisions might look a little bit different for students who participate in STAR Alternate 2 is actually that when we think about those two options where we started at the top of today's presentation, that option 1 and option 2, master teacher or the supplemental instruction requirement for 30 hours, for our students with significant cognitive disabilities who are eligible for participation in the STAR Alternate 2, those two accelerated instruction options are not the only options available to the ARD committee. So certainly they have the ability to consider those options for a student who participates in STAR Alternate 2, and those options might be viable options for providing accelerated instruction to that student. However, they're not limited to those two options in making accelerated instruction decisions for students with significant cognitive disabilities and participate in alternate assessment. They might consider other ways for that student to receive accelerated learning that can be very individualized based on that student's unique and specific needs. Of course, there's always the potential that there may be parental disagreement regarding some provision in a student's individualized education program or around the delivery of accelerated instruction or development of an accelerated learning plan. There are some avenues for families to follow should they have a disagreement with an ARD committee regarding a decision. It is important to keep in mind that there are sort of a couple different pathways here when we start thinking about accelerated instruction specifically. If a family member or a caregiver of a student with a disability has any disagreement with their child's ARD committee related to the provision of a free and appropriate public education, which really is any component of that student's IEP, there is a dispute resolution mechanism. That mechanism is described in Texas Administrative Code. It's Chapter 89, Section 891150. And that option exists to help resolve any disputes between a parent or guardian and a public education agency specifically related to the provision of FAPE, the identification and evaluation of a child with a disability, or the educational placement of that student. That's really related to anything around special education related services provision. If a parent or a guardian of a student served by special education specifically has concern about accelerated instruction and does not agree with the ARD committee's decisions or some component of the accelerated learning plan that has been developed by the ARD committee as they're serving the function of the ALC, then that student's parent or guardian should follow the school district's established grievance policy. HB 4545 did establish a requirement for local education agencies to create a grievance process related to accelerated instruction. So this is a grievance process that's available to any family member or caregiver of a student related to the provision of accelerated instruction. So HB 4545 required districts to put this into place if a parent or a guardian of a child with a disability specifically has a disagreement related to the accelerated instruction or accelerated learning plan. This could be the delivery of supplemental accelerated instruction, or something of that nature, what that really looks like for the student. That family member may follow the LEA's grievance policy as it's related to AI and the policy that applies to all students. So it is important to sort of tease out if the parent does have some sort of disagreement or concern, whether that disagreement has to do with the student's IEP, the provision of a free and appropriate public education, or if it's really exclusively about accelerated instruction. And if it is truly about accelerated instruction, then they should be encouraged to follow the district's grievance policy that applies to all students. All right, at this point, we're going to shift into the third element of this morning's presentation and share with you some of the common questions and implementation considerations that we have continuously received and been supporting the field with. And Liz, I'll pass it over to you to step us through the first part of this.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So the first question here is, can the ARD committee waive the accelerated instruction requirement for students with an IEP? The requirement of HB 4545, as we've said throughout the presentation, applies to all students, including students served by special education. And the ARD committee, serving as the ALC, must always consider the individual needs of the student to determine whether adjustments to that accelerated learning plan are appropriate. Supplemental instruction must be provided as required for students served, as required by HB 4545 for students served by special education, unless the ARD committee determines doing so would deny the student a free and appropriate public education, which Jacob had mentioned just before this. We can probably navigate to the next question.
All right, so our next question that we often have received is, what happens if we know that an ARD committee is required to meet and serve as an ALC? We know that the parent is a required participant in that meeting, but what happens if that parent or guardian is actually not able to attend? So there's a couple pieces to consider here. When the ARD committee is required to serve as an ALC, Accelerated Learning Committee, as we mentioned earlier in today's presentation, the local education agency has the responsibility to ensure those are properly constituted ARD committee meetings in accordance with state and federal requirements under IDEA. And IDEA does provide some specific parameters around parental participation. These are located at CFR section 300.322. And just to kind of summarize what those requirements are, this does require that ARD committees schedule the meeting at a mutually agreed upon time and place, and that the parent or guardian of the student with a disability is notified of the committee meeting early enough to ensure that they do have an opportunity to attend. ARD committees also are responsible to make sure there are reasonable efforts to reach out to the parent or guardian of a student with a disability to schedule these meetings. This can look a couple different ways. Typically, it's a written notification. That written notification can be provided to the parent directly in person, can be mailed to the parent, can also follow up with the parent using preferred methods of communication, such as emails or phone calls, to ensure that they have received the invitation and are able to attend. ARD committees should also maintain records of these attempts to contact families and take steps to ensure that families are aware of the date, time, and location of that meeting. Also, it is important to note that ARD committee meetings can be conducted via virtual conferencing or teleconferencing with families as needed as well. All right, Liz, back to you.
So the next question is an IEP amendment allowable to address a student's need for AI or accelerated instruction? For students who did not pass or take the 3rd, 5th, or 8th grade reading or math STAAR, the ARD Committee, acting as the ALC, is required to convene when making those decisions regarding the accelerated instruction program. Where the ALC is not required to meet, then an amendment would be allowed to document the accelerated learning plan. In any case, a copy of the ALP must be provided to the parent in writing. We can go to the next slide.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next question here that is fairly common is how should ARD committees document accelerated learning plans for students served by special education? This has been a point of some confusion, I think, for some folks in the field, so happy to dive into that a little bit today. There's a couple of ways that ARD committees should document accelerated learning plans for students who are served by special education. The first means is as a supplemental attachment that can be attached to the student's IEP. And the second option is to document those considerations or the accelerated learning plan in the deliberation section of a student's IEP. In thinking about these options, if the student is going to be receiving supplemental accelerated instruction, so again, with those 30 hours per subject area, those services are considered an extension of the general education curriculum that's provided to all students. So just to reiterate, this was mentioned a little bit earlier in today's presentation, but when we're thinking about that supplemental instruction, it is an extension of high quality tier 1. So for that reason, it is really important to note that accelerated supplemental instruction services are not considered special education services. Those are not services that are uniquely designed to meet a student's individual learning needs. Those supplemental accelerated instruction hours are really part of the general education experience that's offered to all students. So it's really important that ARD committees are documenting these decisions in either one of these two ways, but it is not required for ARD committees, and ARD committees actually should not be documenting these supplemental accelerated instruction hours in the services page of the student's IEP. The only allowable options for ARD committees when they're serving as ALCs in terms of documentation of an accelerated learning plan are the two options listed here. So again, as a supplemental attachment or within the deliberation section of the IEP. And Liz, back to you.
Yeah, so the next question is, if a student receives resource services with a special education teacher, can this be considered accelerated instruction? Super important to clarify that a resource classroom or resource services are not accelerated instruction services. The supplemental instruction is not a special education service, whereas the services in a resource classroom or resource setting, which are required based on the student's disability-related needs, would be. So specially designed instruction provided in a resource setting is a program of instruction provided to the student as part of the student's FAPE, and again, not supplemental. So therefore, the 30 hours per subject area must be provided in addition to any services that the student is already receiving according to their IEP. We can go on to the next slide.
All right. Another question that we commonly receive, and I see in the chat here, it looks like there is a question about this topic from some folks in the audience today. So thinking about our high school students who take end of course assessments or EOCs, if an ARD committee determines that a passing score on an EOC is not required for that student to graduate, is accelerated instruction still required? So to address that question, one, just want to clarify that under Texas Administrative Code at Chapter 89, 1070, there is an allowance that ARD committees for students who are in high school in grades 9 through 12 can determine whether a student is required to achieve satisfactory performance on an EOC assessment instrument in order to receive a high school diploma. So given that, the question that we often get is, so if the ARD committee actually makes this decision that a student does not need to demonstrate satisfactory performance on a given EOC assessment instrument for a particular course, does that then modify, waive, or change in some way the requirement for that student to participate in accelerated instruction? So in fact, it does not. An ARD committee's decision that a student does not need to pass a particular EOC assessment in a particular course, they can determine that that's not required in order for the student to graduate from high school. However, that does not waive the accelerated instruction requirement for the student. Let's say a little bit more about that. So when an ARD committee makes this decision and this student is not successful on an EOC, there continue to exist learning gaps in that EOC subject area. Therefore, the accelerated instruction requirement as it's described in TEC section 280211 that was amended, of course, by House Bill 4545, that requirement doesn't change according to this ARD committee decision around graduation requirement. So in a case where, for example, a student takes an EOC assessment, they're not successful, and then that student is provided with the minimum 30 hours of supplemental instruction in that subject area because they didn't pass their EOC. And the ARD committee then determines, the student actually does not need to pass the subject area in order to graduate. That student would still be required to complete those 30 hours of supplemental instruction. However, if that student is not going to need to pass that EOC and they're not going to retake that EOC assessment, once they complete those 30 hours of supplemental instruction, no further accelerated instruction requirement would be needed and no retake would be needed, given the ARD committee's decision. Now, if the ARD committee does determine that the student does need to pass that EOC in order to graduate from high school, and that student was not successful on the first administration, they then complete 30 hours of supplemental instruction, then they retake that EOC, and they're not successful again, that would mean the student is required to participate in an additional 30 hours of supplemental instruction in that subject area. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit around that question. All right, Liz, back to you.
Yeah, and for this last question, I know we're close to time here. So if a student has a Section 504 plan, does the 504 committee serve as the ALC? The HB 4545 doesn't explicitly address the 504 committees. So accelerated instruction applies to all students, and any plan developed for a student with the 504 plan must be consistent with the general education requirements. Where implementation of AI is required, it is highly recommended that the 504 committee is informed and involved in developing that accelerated learning plan for that student. Go ahead, Jacob.
Thanks, Liz. Just wanted to share a couple of resources with folks today as we get ready to close out. I see there are a couple additional questions in chat. We'll try to address those in the last couple minutes here if we can. So there are some resources just want to call your attention to. We do have an accelerated learning website at the agency, and that's linked here. You can also use this QR code on the left side of your screen to navigate directly there. We do have a fairly extensive FAQ related to House Bill 4545 that includes many of the questions that we addressed in today's presentation, as well as many more. So if you would really like to explore additional questions related to accelerated instruction and students with disabilities, would encourage you to take a look at that FAQ and see if your question is included there. Many questions are. Should you have follow-up questions about the requirements in House Bill 4545, would encourage you to please send those over to us. You can use the accelerated instruction inbox, which is accelerated.instruction@tea.texas.gov. It's listed here on the slide. As Liz and I mentioned earlier at the top of today's presentation, we do collaborate really closely with our colleagues in the agency around supporting districts with implementation of these accelerated learning requirements. So any questions related to serving students with disabilities likely will be involved in helping to answer those questions for you, should you have them. And actually, it looks like we are at time. I know that one of the questions in the chat asked about where to locate this presentation. We will work with our conference organizers and ensure that we can get this uploaded, hopefully here on the Visivo platform, so that folks can continue to access these materials after today's session. I believe the recording will be available to you as well. If we were not able to address your specific question in the chat, we'll work to make sure we get copies of those questions and can, again, work with our folks across the agency to make sure that we either update that FAQ or get those questions answered in some way. So that said, we really thank you for participating in today's session. We've covered some of the foundations of HB 4545 and accelerated instruction and the specific responsibilities of ARD committees and many of the commonly asked questions around these requirements as they apply to students served by special education. We hope that this presentation has helped address some of the questions that you have and hope that your experience in the rest of today's summit is a fantastic one. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. And again, if you should have any follow-up questions, please do reach out.
Awesome, thank you. And just FYI, the chat will remain open for 20 more minutes if you want to post any questions there. Thank you.